is Swapo.
Yeah.
The other petition are the small parties and whatnot.
Mm.
Here is the founding president. This is the late Jacob Kuhangwa, Secretary General of Swapo. This is myself when I was chairman of Swapo. This is Reverend Michael Scott, and this is Kozongwizi and others.
It's quite an achievement.
Yeah, sure. When we achieved our independence, I'm sure that all our people were very excited about it.
Yeah.
There were many promises made by politicians, including our own politicians of Swapo, which is quite natural. You know, it happens in all the elections around the world. Politicians always promise heaven on earth, and not always do they deliver what they have promised fully. Namibia, after independence, could have become a very, very stable and rich country with 2 million people. We have promised our people that we will do our best, and especially Swapo, that is the ruling party. The other small parties, you know, they were doing their thing, as it has always been the case with small opposition parties in other African countries and so forth. But what is very important here is that even though Swapo has really become the ruling party of the country, we have come from a very difficult background. A background starting from German colonization that included genocide, into the South African apartheid schemes and laws and oppression, in a system that created slave labor based on cheap, contract system called Okaholo. All these problems were inherited by Swapo after independence. And naturally our people also had high hopes that Swapo will change things overnight, which is impossible for a country that has come from where it has come from to change things overnight. But so far I think Swapo has done its best to fulfill some of the promises that were made during the 435 UN general elections. Naturally, like what has happened in all African countries previously colonized, enthusiasm has always been very high, and delivery was based on the reality of the situation that we have inherited. Unlike many other African countries that have, and many of them probably in comparison to us, had a very strong foundation of education. Namibia suffered from Bantu education of the racist South African government. We didn't have universities here. We had to travel to South Africa, you know, and during the time that we were in exile, that was the only opportunity that we had for our students to also be admitted to other universities in other African countries. All this have taken toll on us. Our youth had their own expectations about independence and what independence will bring. And we're beginning to see the results today, that this enthusiasm that our youth had, some of it was misplaced. But our youth, you know, are also very well disciplined. They are also, you know, trying their best to support our country and our government and so forth. Even though, you know, they also have their own needs that they want to have look after by the government. We also have inherited a problem of separation of our people who have been divided in ethnic groups. our people were compartmentalized by the apartheid regime in even the settlement in cities.
Yeah.
They were divided according to their ethnic, situations. You had Swapo speaking in one section of the location, the Herero speaking, and so forth and so forth. And these are things that are real, and that Swapo had to deal with as a government. And if you look at the whole situation and what Swapo has done to be able to bring our country together, in an effort to create one nation, and one people, it has not been very easy. And I think sometimes we overtaxed our ruling party, and especially with the burden of the government that they have inherited from the past. And I always believe that even with our young people, they sometimes have to be patient about what we have gone through.
Yeah.
I personally support young people. I've supported them since we created Swapo. And you must also remember that Swapo is the only party in this country that was born by the conditions that existed of slavery in our country. When we created Swapo, I said to the founding president, we must actually have this party that must be born by the situation that exists in our country. If we can find a name from that situation, no party in this country will actually substitute Swapo in power, so easily. And it has happened. We started with Okaholo.
Yeah.
Okaholo was slave cheap labor of our young people, like our young people today, and recruited for South African mining companies in Johannesburg, in Kimberley. Many of them were sent to the farms, the white farms in this country. Many of them died there at the end of their contract time, that when they expired. And it is from these conditions that Chief Hosea Kutako, actually with his chief council, decided to form a small group of young people who were being sent to the farms because of the stories that used to come from the farms, from the workers, the contract workers, that some of their associates were being killed at the end of their contract because the farmers didn't want to pay their salaries and so forth. And these young people used to go and collect that information and bring this information to the chief council of Chief Hosea Kutako that was composed not just of Hereros. I know many people of Shikongo speaking, they were also members. I know Kalats, I know Namas, I know Damaras, you can name them all. And when this information came, that was the information that the Chief Council collected and put together so that they can find somebody who can take them to the United Nations to give a report about conditions in our country. For a long time, South Africa refused our people passports to travel to New York to go and testify there about the conditions in our country. But eventually, through the help of Chief Tsekedi Kama of Botswana, he had friends with the Indian South African Congress. And one of the gentlemen who was a very close friend of his was Cathadra, who was on Robben Island with Mandela and others, including Adimba Toevo, including Jerry Ekanjo, who was the youngest of them all. And Cathadra acceded to the invitation of Chief Tsekedi Kama to actually persuade a missionary from England who was working in South Africa. And when Cathadra approached Reverend Michael Scott that Chief Tsekedi Kama wanted to see him, he agreed and went to Botswana. He was taken by Cathadra. So Chief Tsekedi Kama said, no, The best person now that you can talk to is Chief Frederick Maharero of the Herero people in Botswana, who fled the genocide from Namibia, that white German Southwest Africa at that time. And they went and met, and Chief Frederick said, I'm not in a position now because I live in Botswana. The person who has been entrusted with the responsibilities of the Herero people is Chief Hosea Kutako in Southwest Africa. We must make preparations for you to go and meet with him. So finally, arrangements were made, and Reverend Michael Scott was brought here to meet with Chief Hosea Kutako in Aminus. And that's where they discussed the conditions that Reverend Michael Scott had to take to the United Nations after it was created by the Allied powers.
Yeah.
And when the petitions were put together, Reverend Michael Scott left with his petition to take them to the United Nations. And that's how our case was brought up in the United Nations and eventually became part of the annual General Assembly agenda. And then, of course, time went on. When our people were suffering under the South African government, they also decided that they must now begin to think about probably forming new formal political parties. I was already in the United States after living Southwest Africa as a student to go and study medicine, and I was admitted at Lincoln University in America, where I studied, and eventually I was asked to go to the United Nations by the Chiefs Council. We didn't have political parties then. So I finally went and to the United Nations to ask to be heard by the United Nations. And South Africa came up with a ploy and said that we must ask advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice as to whether a born native from Southwest Africa can be granted oral hearing by the General Assembly to talk about the conditions of the country that is under our administrations. We remained for a year waiting for that advisory opinion until in 1956 the International Court of Justice passed a favorable advisory opinion in our favor that I must be allowed to petition or present oral petition to the United Nations together with Reverend Michael Scott, who was then for 10 years fighting for us alone. And that's how I joined Reverend Michael Scott. The time passed very fast. And eventually, one day I said to Reverend Michael Scott, the work is getting too much for the two of us.
Yeah.
And you know, I see that the United Nations delegations, presidents, ministers, ambassadors and whatnot, they don't seem to be very comfortable with us representing traditional leaders.
Yeah.
They are urging that we form political parties. Yes. And so I made, Reverend Michael Scott said, well, talk to Chief Hosea Kutako and the Chief Council so that they can do something and send a third person to us.
Yeah.
Eventually, I sent the letter to Chief Hosea Kutako through our own grapevine, underground that we had. And finally, of course, at that time, the late Mahuriri, Nathaniel Mahuriri, was a member of the Chief Council. So, and he could speak English because he was a student from Odibo at that time. So finally, they decided that they will send Mahuriri. Unfortunately, Mahuriri's age could not fit the politics of exile.
Yeah.
So I told them, I said, if Mahuriri comes, we're going to have problems because his age, the politics here of exile is very serious. At least we're working at night and going to school and doing all kinds of things, working in restaurant, washing dishes and things like that, to survive. And so finally, it was at the same time that the founding president, Dr. Sam Nujoma, had joined the chief council.
Yeah.
So Chief Jose Abutako said, well, we have a young man here who's attending St. Barnabas Night School under Chief Clemens Kapua as his teacher,
Yeah.
teaching him English. Maybe he'll be a person suitable for exile together with you guys.
Yeah.
And finally I said, it is well. Let us go ahead, send Sam Nujoma, let him come, because his age and the difference is just about 3 or 4 years, you know. We can manage it,
Yeah.
and we can run around all over the place to lobby the nations and the governments of the world to support us and so forth. And finally came the 10th of December 1959. And our people were killed. My brother was killed because I was petitioning at the United Nations. When that happened, they were also, the South Africans were also looking for a founding president because he was organizing in the contract compounds,
Yeah.
you know, of the contract workers about OPC and
OPC.
then moving into OPO.
OPO, yeah.
Yes, OPO. And so finally, he escaped from the country, and through Ghana, eventually, he was able to reach us at the United Nations. We petitioned together at the United Nations, and at that time, OPC had already gone ahead moving the contract workers in the country. Now, we want to unite all our people in the north.
Yes.
With this organization, it's just for the young, contract workers. Come up with a better name that will actually help to unite all our ethnic groups in the north. And I said, okay, why don't we call it Ovamboland People's Organization? That's how OPO came into the picture. And then, of course, came the question as to how are we going to now touch the central region and the south.
Yeah.
We must come up with this. Not the Ovamboland, because the people will shun us.
Yes.
So they asked me again, come up with a name. And eventually, I came up with the name Southwest Africa People's Organization to move down, And that's how OPO came into the picture.
Yeah.
So Swapo's great-grandmother was OPC.
Yeah.
The grandmother
So
was OPO, OPO. And eventually it became Swapo that took over the rest of the country.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the struggle continued until eventually, when we started suffering and actually being killed by the Boers and so forth, the question of armed struggle, following in the footsteps of other African liberation movements in other countries in Africa, came up. How long are we going to allow ourselves to be killed in the way that we were being killed by the South African racist regime? And finally, we decided that we must adopt the policy of tooth for a tooth.
Yeah.
But we must also find countries that will help to train our young people. And founding president also decided to throw his weight and started organizing our youth for the armed struggle. They were sent to Algeria, Egypt, everywhere. And that's how many of our young people were leaving the country. And they were put in refugee camps in Tanzania, Zambia, in Angola, what have you. And they were dedicated. Many of them died and passed on the AK-47 to those who remained. Yes. Those who remained executed the struggle until eventually the United States decided to see that if they allow the armed struggle to continue with the pace that it is now continuing, it might also affect their interest in South Africa, where they have had heavy investments.
Yes.
And then they came up with the idea of the four Western powers. When the four Western powers were created by the United Nations, the Germans then came up and said that They know Namibia very well, having been their former colony. They would like to also be associated with the 4 Western powers, and that's how they became the 5 Western powers.
5 Western powers.
Yes. And naturally, the 5 Western powers were very helpful in, since it involves major powers like the United States, to persuade South Africa to give in to the demands and pressure of the United Nations. And by that time, the armed struggle has also taken toll on South Africa. And it made a difference, a major difference. And the armed struggle was not meant to really succeed maybe victoriously, you know?
Yeah.
It was meant to put pressure in addition to all the other international pressures that were being now put on South Africa. And the Swapo government negotiated and accepted the 5 Western powers to negotiate with them and to brokerage our involvement, our opening up of the United Nations in our country under 435. That's how eventually independence was crafted by Swapo.
Yeah.
But it was crafted through the blood and the sweat of our young people. It should, you know, we, the older generation,
Yeah.
always say the struggle, I mean, our youth are our future.
Yes.
But we seem to be hanging on power, even in our older ages. I don't support that. I'm with the founding president that we have done our best.
Yeah.
We define our future when the need arose at that time when we were fighting.
Fighting for the liberation struggle.
Yeah, and we said freedom and independence in our lifetime. We define our future that time.
Yeah.
It is this future that we gave you.
Yeah.
You must now, you know, we are not going to live in this coming future of computers and new technologies and whatnot. You are going to be living there. Define that future yourself. We'll give you support, you know. And I'm one of those who will never choose, I mean, will never, you know, shy away from supporting our youth. I always encourage them that when they are fighting us, you know, because we have come through the bitter struggle, then they must not fight us on the basis as if we don't like them.
Yeah.
We like to listen to them, but they must also respect us
Yeah.
when they talk to us, like we did with our older generation that is gone,
Yes.
right? And at this particular time, you, the youth, you and us have seen what has happened.
Yeah.
You know, our people are talking about our government probably has failed to fulfill the dream.
Yes.
I also personally believe that we should have moved faster to fulfill probably 2/3 of the dream than being where we are now. We cannot go to China with heads in hands asking for amounts of monies that we are asking without going with programs designed to improve the quality of our lives of our people. When we go to countries like China, China has come through the same process that we have come through. But during all those years, China never went around with heads in hands begging for financial support, you know, or loans and so forth. They did their own number until when they were eventually admitted to the United Nations. We have a tendency to believe that money grows on trees in all the countries that we try to go and beg. We don't want to be beggars. We want to be accepted as equals with pride. So if you say we must go to China and ask for money, then we must do our homework, because the Chinese have experts and they're going to ask $10 billion that you are asking. What are you going to spend it on? We must do that homework first. And then when we go to Chinese, we can then say that here are our programs. Can you look at this roster of these programs and see which ones would you be able to help us with loans and then negotiate on that basis. I personally, I'm like with the founding president, that if you go and beg, you lose your credibility, you lose your respect. We don't want our youth to lose the respect because of the mismanagement and the corruption of stealing taxpayers' money in this country. We don't have a big population like South Africa with 60 million. Huh? We have just 2 million people. We cannot afford to steal money of taxpayers here when we have students who have to be supported here by the government. And now we are turning around to say that we don't have money even for the students. We are crucifying our children, our youth, who can be able to actually save us in our country to get it out of this mud. Personally, I believe that the young people must rise and then take a look at themselves and find out whether they have one of their kind to be able to be your rallying model, You as youth, and I want to appeal to you very strongly that in this coming election, the youth constitute the majority of our voters in this country. Band together, don't be terrorized by anybody, don't be afraid, just as we were not afraid to pick up the AK-47. Go out there and support your candidate to be president of this country so that we can get out of this mud. You know your problems better. These old people don't know your problems. You are the ones who know your problems. And I have hope that if our young people, and especially the older generation, can start to leave the young people and bring them into the system so that they can grow together with them and help them, they can change this country, very, very much. I don't care who you find, whether it's from within the ruling party or the new candidates that are called independent candidates. Our constitution is very flexible about this kind of things, Do everything possible within the law of the country and keep this country secure and the rule of law strong. In a democratic process, the youth are the future. And the youth make the difference. Young people have changed governments around the world. I don't know why our young people in Namibia cannot do the same if others have done it. You fought this war. Not old people. No. Our young people died. They didn't die for nothing. They sacrificed their lives in order to gain a future. And this is the future that is knocking at your doors. Why do you want to negotiate an unnegotiable, future that belongs to you, where you alone are going to live there? Don't listen to old people who have, misused their opportunities to change this country. Change this country for your interest and your future generations. You have children coming. You are well educated. Why do you worry about old people whose future now has come to a dead end? They have done their best. They've given you the future. Now you have to be their boss to decide and define that future. Why should you be defined by those who have given it to you? We've given it to you. We are prepared, those of us who are prepared to help you. We'll be there to babysit with you, if you need us. I can't see any other way around.